Scopper Gaban takes a look at the monster trio and says that the only two who have Conqueror's Haki are Luffy and Zoro. Sanji in this scene pesters Gaban about also being a conqueror, yet Gaban does not give him any recognition. Essentially, the scene basically confirms that Gaban was not able to sense any Conqueror's Haki from Sanji. But this does not actually mean that Sanji is not a conqueror. Let me prove to you why. This is in fact something we've seen time and again in One Piece, where even if you were born with Conqueror's Haki, nobody can actually sense that you have it unless you use it. This is, for example, what literally happened with Luffy. When Luffy used his Conqueror's Haki in Marineford, almost all of the characters who witnessed it were in shock. This included several characters who had fought Luffy in past arcs and who themselves know how to use Haki. But most importantly, even Garp until this moment did not for a fact know that Luffy had Conqueror's Haki. This was despite the fact that Garp was the man who'd personally trained Luffy since he was a child, meaning that he should have been able to sense Luffy's conquerors even before Marineford if that was possible. This is however a running theme with Conqueror's Haki. Nobody actually knows whether a character has it or not, unless they've used it. This happened with Zoro in Wano, where Kaido only realized he had conquerors after he was hit by Zoro's Ashura. It also happened when Yamato as a kid knocked out random beast pirates. And it happened when Treble saw Doflamingo using his conquerors when he was just a kid. And basically, it happens pretty much every time when a character is first seen using conquerors, where the first reaction is almost always surprise. In other words, One Piece has very consistently shown that inactive Conqueror's Haki cannot be sensed by anyone, even if you are one of the most elite characters in the whole story. In this latest chapter, Gaban had actually already known Zoro had Conqueror's Haki from before, as Zoro had literally used it during their earlier fight in the castle. But even beyond this, Luffy in this chapter says that Zoro is essentially leaking his Haki out. In other words, Gaban is able to tell that Zoro has conquerors, because he's literally seen him use it, but he can neither confirm or deny whether Sanji also has it. For the record, this is something that seemingly only applies to conquerors. Characters can apparently still sense regular Haki even if it is not being used. As for example, Blackbeard all the way back in Impel Down said that he was able to tell Luffy's Haki had gotten stronger. I honestly think this scene where Sanji badgers Gaban about also wanting to have Conqueror's Haki not only does not confirm that Sanji doesn't have it, but is pretty much blatant foreshadowing that Sanji will in the future unlock his Conqueror's Haki. This is because this is almost beat for beat what happened with Zoro in Wano. In chapter 997, Zoro attacked Queen and the surrounding area shook, leading to Brook saying that Zoro must be using Conqueror's Haki. This was however not the case, and the shaking was actually caused by Kaido lifting Onigashima. In literally 13 chapters after this scene, Zoro is confirmed to be a Conqueror's Haki user in his fight against Kaido. Basically, I think what the story is very obviously doing is feeding fan speculation. Because Zoro having conquerors had been teased right before it happened, that ended up creating way more buzz for Zoro's big reveal, and I'm fairly certain this is exactly what One Piece is currently doing with Sanji. Granted, this isn't always the case, and sometimes these scenes are just played for laughs, like when Jinbei at the beginning of the Egghead arc commented on Nami being a possible conqueror. If you want a full breakdown on why I think Sanji will indeed unlock his Conqueror's Haki in Elbaf, you should click here to check out my previous chapter breakdown video. But be warned, I had to use an AI English voice for that one. Gaban in this chapter finally confirms that Conqueror's Haki is indeed the way to counter the Celestial Dragon's regeneration, but it is interesting that he doesn't give Luffy any more details than this. From looking at the Japanese, what Gaban says is Haoshoku Haki no tsukaikata o Kimo ni meichiru, which I think was pretty accurately translated as Luffy needing to be mindful with how he uses his conquerors. Kimo ni meichiru is an extremely strange Japanese expression where it literally means to engrave to your liver, but really, as far as I know, it means the exact same thing as the English expression to take something to heart. Because Gaban does not tell Luffy anything else though, I'm not even sure what he wants him to take to heart here. I suppose Gaban could be intentionally vague, so that Luffy will learn things on his own, but this to me would be very odd, considering how dangerous the current situation is. Gaban in this arc has been incredibly concerned about the safety of Elbaf, and this makes perfect sense since this island has now been his home for decades. There's also the little detail about Gaban's literal family being currently threatened. So, at least for me, he could be a little bit more helpful with his advice on how to fight these characters. In a way, this is the Rayleigh situation all over again, where for whatever reason, Rayleigh during the time skip didn't tell Luffy anything about techniques like Haki emission or Conqueror's coding, yet at the same time was willing to give Luffy the rundown on things like future sight. Now, granted, with Gaban, this is at least a bit more easy to accept, since we know Conqueror's Haki cannot actually be trained, but only gets stronger with the user. In other words, the technique to damage Imu and the God's Knights might genuinely be something you have to learn on the fly. Gaban is however still being a bit of a hypocrite in this chapter by telling Zoro that power needs to be understood and tamed, and that he'd expect better from a Yonko crew, even though he himself is the one giving extremely vague instructions. Despite there being so many similarities between Gaban and Sanji throughout this arc, their first interaction is not much to write home about, where Gaban does not even genuinely address Sanji. This isn't too unexpected however, where even though Rayleigh was also clearly presented as Roger's Zoro, him and Zoro never had that many interactions either. I honestly like this kind of writing, where I don't think it would be that interesting if the manga tried to force Sanji and Gaban to be similar in their every interaction. And this chapter actually does a fairly good job showing how the two are also very different. I'm personally hoping this is what will also ultimately happen with Joy Boy and Luffy, where we will eventually see that Joy Boy too was his own distinct character, and not just a historic prototype of Luffy. While on the topic of Luffy, him asking Luffy to join his crew is in my opinion another case of the manga creating discussion around the story, where I do not think it will actually happen. Oda and his team are in my opinion hyper aware of the topics that drive up conversation among fans, and the topic of who will be the next Straw Hat is up there with things like Zoro vs Sanji, where it is constantly and deliberately brought up by the manga to tease the fans. This pretty much happens in every arc, where some characters are very clearly set up as potential Straw Hats, not because the story actually plans on them joining, but because it's a great way to get the fans talking. Loki definitely fulfills some criteria of characters that have previously joined the crew, but in all honesty, I think he's just another bait crewmate. Oda has for years now been absolutely set on the idea that Luffy will have only 10 followers, and the way I see it, he's also set on the final one being Vivi. I last year made an honestly pretty mediocre video about this, but even though I didn't articulate it that well, the evidence is still rock solid, and whether you like it or not, the evidence all but confirms that Vivi is the final Straw Hat. If you're interested, you can click here to check that video out. While Haryudin says that Loki has 3 minutes to tell his story, I think this flashback may actually end up taking several chapters, where we're not only exploring what happened 14 years ago with Loki, but are also jumping all the way back to over 100 years ago, to an era we've never before seen in One Piece. While I doubt it will be something as long as the Oden flashback, I genuinely would not be surprised if we basically spent the rest of the summer with this backstory. The flashback definitely starts with a bang, where it finally confirms that Loki was not indeed the one who started the massacre in Orust Castle. I think this could actually be a bit of a whodunit situation. Gaban said that he'd on this day sensed a strange haki coming from the castle, and it is also very possible that the magic circle Shamrock and Gunko used to travel to Elbaf had already been in the castle for years, and possibly was already there during this event. In other words, it is very likely that some world government character was the one who made these guards attack Harald. Even though it was only around 2 pages, this scene between Shanks and Gaban gave a ton of extremely interesting information. By far the most interesting thing, however, is that this scene is set a few years before Shanks met Luffy, so we actually get to see Shanks with both of his arms, where Shanks actually has the symbol used by the God's Knights on the arm he later gave to the Lord of the Coast. While this hasn't been confirmed, this could also very likely be the mark of the Abyss that Gillingham said was needed if you wanted to travel using the magic circles. The really interesting question to ask, however, is when did Shanks get this mark? We actually have a scene of Shanks bathing in the Oden flashback, but conveniently because of the angle, we can't tell if he had the mark at this point, meaning that in theory, this mark could even literally be something Shanks was born with. However, I personally lean more towards Shanks getting this mark only later in his life, based on Gunko, Imu can seemingly still grant characters the mark after they are born, as I very much doubt Imu gave Kunko her mark when she was just a kid hanging out with Brook. If Imu can do this, I do not really see a reason why Imu would give infant Shanks this mark, if it could still be given to him at a later age. Shanks also says in this chapter that his life had changed dramatically in the 10 years after Roger's death, and one of the important events that happened to Shanks at this point was him going to the Holy Land, where he met Harald. This chapter suggests that one of the ways Shanks' life changed was that for a time he was actually friendly towards the world government. He not only possibly received this mark, but was even allowed into the Holy Land and to talk to an important guest like Harald, seemingly at his leisure. Shanks, however, clearly still had his own plans at this point, where there was something with Harald he wanted to talk about but couldn't in the Holy Land, which is apparently the reason why he came to Elbaf. I do not actually think there is currently enough information to make a solid guess about what Shanks planned to do with the government. The simplest explanation is that he simply tried to reconnect with his biological family, but then realized just how evil they were and decided against it. Another simple explanation could be that Shanks at this point in his life simply wanted to get stronger, where he could have wanted power by any means necessary to essentially become the next Roger. This is seemingly the running theme with all of Shanks' actions in this period, where he gathered the strongest pirates from all of the seas to be his crew, had legendary duels with someone like Mihawk, and even sought out the Nika Devil Fruit. Shanks for a time trying to cooperate with the government could have been for this same reason, where he might have only done it to get access to Imu's power. This is also seemingly what Shanks said to Whitebeard about the reason why he ultimately lost his arm, where he apparently bet it on the next generation. This has been my personal interpretation about why Shanks lost his arm for a while, where he at the moment decided that Luffy, not him, was going to be the next Roger, and that while Shanks himself was also still going to go after the One Piece, he was just going to do it as himself, not trying to be like other people or using any powers but his own. But really, I am not set on this idea, and there are plenty of other interesting ideas the story could go with. I am actually not too sure what powers the Mark of the Abyss could grant someone like Shanks, other than the ability to travel around the world using the magic circles. This is because I do not actually think the Mark grants you all of Imu's special powers. For one, regeneration is seemingly not included in its abilities. While it's true that Shanks did not regenerate after the Lord of the Coast took his arm, based on the Egghead arc, the Elders were actually able to regenerate even after Luffy literally blew them to bits. Based on this panel, the Elders' mark should have been wiped away with the rest of their bodies, yet they were still able to regenerate. I also do not think the mark gives you telepathy either, as Imu is seemingly able to telepathically talk to and observe all of the Elders and the God's Knights. If Shanks had had this ability, Imu should have surely been able to see that he was in Fusha village with the Nika fruit, yet Shanks was seemingly able to stay in the village for an entire year without being disturbed. I think it is actually looking more and more likely that the mark only grants you the ability to traverse the abyss, and none of these other special powers. We already know Imu doesn't grant his entire set of special abilities to all of his followers, where for example, Garling seemingly did not have the same longevity as the original Elders or Kunko. Genuinely though, we know so little of how the Abyss or Imu's powers actually work that it is incredibly hard to say anything that is actually concrete about this topic. There is however one major theory this chapter finally put to bed. According to Shamrock, Shanks had only returned to the Holy Land at one point, and since we now know this point was years ago in the past, this confirms that the man who met the Elders during the reverie was indeed Shamrock. This was where I was personally leaning to, where Shamrock simply made way more sense to me, as for example, the government in the present story clearly very much does not trust Shanks. I think how this all basically went down was that Shanks, for whatever reason, started warming up his relations with the government after Roger's death, but that all of this then at some point stopped, and that there was no going back after Shanks stole the Nika fruit. Just for reference, Shanks in chapter 1 already had a bounty of over 1 billion berries, so he was clearly past his honeymoon phase with the government. This is just a random idea, but I think one simple reason for why Shanks might have wanted to butter up to the government Could have been that he simply wanted Roger's remains back from them. We know this is something Shanks cares a lot about, since he specifically wanted to take care of both Whitebeard and Ace's remains at Marineford, and later help the Whitebeard pirates in holding the funeral. Gaban calls Shanks the Child of Destiny in this chapter, and this is incredibly interesting for the simple fact that Gaban should know that Shanks cannot be the next Joy Boy. After the Roger pirates went to Laughdale, they learned for a fact that the next Joy Boy hadn't been born yet, which would mean that Shanks was out of the pecking, as he was already a young man at this point. I think this could however be in reference to something very different, where years before he'd even gone to Laughdale, Roger had already given his straw hat to Shanks when he was just a kid. On top of this, Shanks still kept the hat even after Roger learned that Shanks couldn't be the next Joy Boy, even though the hat and Joy Boy are seemingly connected. While it could be that the Roger pirates simply saw Shanks as being special because he was a celestial dragon raised by pirates, or because of his immense talent, I think it is also possible that Gaban is being literal, where Shanks could have his very own prophecy that has nothing to do with Joy Boy. This would not actually be that crazy, as a lot of other characters who've been built up for the Great War like Shirahoshi, Momonosuke and the First Generation have similar prophecies behind them. In other words, while Luffy may be the central character of the Great War itself is built up to be this gathering of people the world has been waiting for ages. One last thing I'll bring up about this scene between Gaban and Shanks are their scars. Shanks already had his scar from Blackbeard in this scene, which would mean that he in the timeline got it at some point in the 10 years after Roger's execution, back when Shanks and Teach were still very young, considering just how active he was in this period. It genuinely would not surprise me if Shanks was actually the instigator of this fight. Gaban meanwhile does not have the same scar he does in the current story in this flashback scene. When Gaban was introduced earlier in the arc, I actually made a theory that he could have made a little incursion to Wano to try to avenge Soden, which is where he could have literally gotten this scar from Kaido, which would still make sense in the timeline. But really, I suppose it could have also been given to him by Loki if Shanks and Gaban tried stopping him together. While I do not want to rag on them too much, the fact that Dory and Broggy were the most infamous pirates on the seas over 100 years ago genuinely makes me think that this is by far the weakest pirating era we've ever heard about. I suppose it however would make sense that a history buff like Roger would have gone to Little Garden to see the headliners of the previous era with his own eyes. While the end of this chapter heavily leans towards Harald being an especially violent king, I am actually not sure if he was that different from his predecessors. At least from what we've been told, Elbaf has been a nation of warmongers for ages, and this was the very thing Harald later tried to reform. Him, however, having started as this kind of traditional king of Elbaf does already make his character more interesting, where he clearly went through quite a character arc. Big thanks to all my members for the loot. Really sorry for the inactivity lately. I'm pretty sure this channel is going to be operating at half throttle for the rest of July, but then return to form in August once I'm back to my country. Anyway, thanks a bunch to everyone who watched this video all the way to the end.